Hi everybody, meteorologist Joe Chaffee. Welcome to tonight's Joe Chaffee Weather Show, the 17th of October, 2019. When you think about it, it's been quite a week, the last 7 days. We had a coastal low last week that eventually became a subtropical storm and then tropical storm Melissa. And while there wasn't a whole lot with that with regards to rain, some of the coastal areas got a bit more. The real story with that was the coastal flooding. Well, we seem to have gotten the part that didn't happen with Melissa certainly happened with this storm last night. 6 hours of rain that swept up from Virginia to southern New England and in areas further north that were north of the low center. You had experienced a prolonged period of rain with several to many inches falling in upstate New York and up into western Vermont. We're going to show you some of the Doppler rain amounts that we have so far, and they're not final numbers because there's still some precip left on the radar. Now, looking ahead, the storm, of course, is going to be moving away. And the wind, by the way, was amazing in terms of the gust that we had. Last night, when I kind of drove home along the back edge of the rain, and as I drove south from Westchester County and then east across Long Island, I drove into the heavy rain. And while it was windy, it wasn't anything worth noting. So I got, by about 10 o'clock, much of the rain was done. There were a few downpours that kind of snuck in and out between 10 and midnight, but that didn't amount to very much. And I was laying in bed a little after midnight, and all of a sudden, I heard the wind just start howling. And that was telling me that I think the coastal low is exploding and dropping down pressures into the 970s, and the wind gusts were... Actually, at that point, I kind of thought, well, maybe we won't see much in terms of the wind. I was waiting for it to crank up, but it finally did. And we had some gusts to 60, 70, and even 80 miles an hour on Long Island. Gusts to 90 miles an hour out on Cape Cod. And I've got some of the wind reports from southern New England to show you. Just really a very impressive storm. And in some of the higher elevations now in upstate New York, in Whiteface, for example, I saw somebody just posted it up here that there's 4 to 6 inches on the ground. I did notice someone had posted a video from up there and a couple of pictures. So it does look like in the highest elevations in northeastern New York and in western Vermont that there's probably some wet snow. So the early skiers might be paying a bit of attention to that. Now we're going to talk about what transpired, where we're going. We also have a potential tropical cyclone in the Gulf of Mexico. No surprise, we were talking about this the last few days. So this looks like it'll probably become a tropical storm. Although when you look at it, it really is not going to gain that sort of classic tropical storm look to it. There's going to be subtropical and non-tropical characteristics to this thing. As it moves northeastward, but it probably will get named either overnight or tomorrow. There are some issues going on now which we'll review, and it does bring some questions for the mid-Atlantic states and a little bit further north for Sunday. Chances are it'll be a miss, but we'll take a look at that. But this could bring some more rain to certainly to the Florida Panhandle, to parts of maybe eastern Alabama, Georgia, South and North Carolina, and into Virginia, and maybe up to the Delmarva Peninsula. So if the 1 to 2 inches of rain that you got with that feeder of tropical moisture that wrapped up into this big storm that we have up in New England, if that wasn't enough rain to alleviate the dry conditions that are in the South, well, this one will help it along as well. So a quick reminder before we get started, if you haven't downloaded my free weather app on Google Play or on the App Store, the Meteorologist Joe Chaffee app, download it. It's absolutely free. You can use it for any location you want. It defaults to your location for local weather conditions and forecasts. And also download the Angry Ben's weather app, the Angry Weatherman, which is available for Android devices, so you can go on Google Play, and hopefully soon we'll have the iPhone version of it. Seems like we're always forever waiting for an iPhone version of something or another. So I'm going to start with WPC's map because this is the rain that we're going to see for the next 7 days, and we do have another cold front to deal with next week, probably around Tuesday or so, and that will account for much of the rain that you see in the Northeast down into maybe Maryland and Delaware and New Jersey. But you see the area of rain that's being produced, and this is going to be from our potential tropical cyclone in the Southwest Gulf, bringing some rain, hefty rains of several inches or more into the Florida Panhandle, and then eventually into Georgia, South Carolina, coastal North Carolina, and Southeast Virginia. The WPC seems to be, if you look at how the moisture lines up, you can pretty much draw a straight line from the Southwest Gulf to off the Mid-Atlantic coast and then out east-northeast from there. That's probably where their thinking was overnight and this morning when this, during today, but they used the overnight guidance. They relied more on the overnight guidance to put their forecast together. And I think that's what they probably were seeing in terms of how this is going to wind up. We're also seeing some hefty rains coming into the Pacific Northwest. And some of that in the colder mountains to the east will translate into some snow. But we have some 5-inch plus amounts there. And we also have several inches of rain possible in parts of Minnesota and just kind of bordering along Lake Superior on the Canadian side. And the rains, by the way, we should pay attention to some of this rain. This is between 8 o'clock tonight and a week from today. So we do have additional significant rains forecast with the next weather front for New York State and for much of New England. So obviously in many areas there the ground is super saturated. So this could prove problematic if we wind up with another sizable rain event in the next 4 or 5 days, which I think we probably will. So we're going to lay this map aside and let's get going as we take a look and review what's happening with what's happened with our storm. I've pulled down 3 Doppler radar views of storm totals that have occurred so far. So this is as of about 3:30 this afternoon. So there's liable to be some places getting a bit higher. It's a little bit tough to see here. I'm going to try to make it as large as I can. Let me try this another way. Hang on one second. Let's try it a different way. Okay, I think that will work. So here you have, so at least you can see the scale on the side a bit better. And the Dopplers, you got to be be a little careful because radars just sort of overlap with each other, so you might get the measurements are not always the same on either side, but you got to figure that near the center of the picture they're certainly going to be pretty accurate. And you'll notice that big, large area, the red is 4 inches or more, that arcs around from the west side of the Catskills and then going all the way around up to I-90, on up to up 87 up the Northway, and then coming back down through the upper and middle Hudson Valley, a large area of 4 inches or more, with 2-inch plus amounts in the yellow, extending down to maybe south of Poughkeepsie, or not too far from Poughkeepsie. We're seeing some 2-inch plus amounts, and then as we shift to the Upton radar, which is right over the over central Long Island, most of the rainfall amounts here. Now, when you check these storm maps for rain totals, the scales are different depending on whose radar you're looking at. So they're not. So on this map, for example, the reds would be 3.5 inches, and the yellows start at 2 inches. And you see these bands of 2-inch plus amounts touching the east end of Long Island, running up into eastern Connecticut. Also, some scattered areas in parts of the Hudson Valley of 2 to 2.5 inches. It was basically about a 1 to 2 inch rainfall that occurred through much of New Jersey, across New York City, to Long Island and into southwestern Connecticut. And when we looked at the actual measured rainfall amounts, that's pretty much how it worked out for that particular zone. And this is the shot from Burlington, Vermont, and their radar. So on their scale, the red is 3 inches, and you see some 3-inch amounts between Rutland and Middleborough, and then you have some lighter amounts as you go further to the north, probably a little mountain shadowing going on up there in northern Vermont, but also big rains up to the New York State-Canadian border up near Plattsburgh, and then on the Canadian side toward Montreal, seeing a little stripe there of, I believe that purple would be 6 inches of rain south and west of Montreal. So clearly we had a quite the event here when it comes to the rainfall that occurred. Now this I pulled off from the Weather Service in Boston, and it was off their Facebook page. So they did put out a graphic showing the highest wind gusts, and you can see on the shaded areas where those strong winds occurred. Mainly Block Island, southeastern Connecticut, southern Rhode Island with gusts into the 50-60 mile an hour range, and then you start to head out toward Cape Cod, and you're looking at 70 and 80 mile an hour winds, and 90 miles an hour being reported at Provincetown. And I did see one report somewhere that said Cape Cod itself had a gust to 100. I haven't seen that duplicated. I didn't find that number on the Boston list of rainfall and wind gusts. If you go to the Weather Service sites of Boston at BOX or New York OKX, you can pull up the text versions of these wind reports and see just exactly wind and rain reports to see who got what, when, and where. So here's your surface map tonight. This is the 18Z. Let's see if we can get the 21Z map up here. It might be ready. But the 18Z map had a 976 low there in central New Hampshire. The 21Z map, and I saw it on the radar, on the loop of the radar. I thought the low might be pretty close to Portland, Maine, around 5 o'clock this afternoon, and that's where it is. And the pressure has risen now to 979 millibars. We saw this, by the way, drop about 25 millibars in pressure over 24 hours. The vast majority of that pressure drop came in about 6 to 9 hours yesterday evening and into the midnight and early morning hours. And as I pointed out yesterday, where you don't want to be is in the path of a developing cyclone where it's undergoing rapid intensification. If you're caught in there, that's when you get a lot of these crazy wind bursts and heavy rains and thunderstorms, and there were thunderstorms that were in the mix last night, particularly over the coastal waters. There were a lot of special marine warnings that went up. I didn't see any reports of waterspouts. It wouldn't have been a shock if there were some, but in the dead of night, how would you see? But here we have a fairly deep low. You don't want to be caught in that phase when the pressures are falling rapidly and the storm is going by you while that's happening, because that's when you get clocked pretty solidly. Now, in this situation, one of the other things that you have to worry about is when you have a low here that's at peak intensity and only weakening very slowly and only moving very slowly. If you are, say, west of the low center or northwest of the low center, you're dealing with bands of heavy rain that are getting thrown back westward. Atlantic moisture coming in from between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and just kind of getting wrapped all the way around on the backside. You've got the upper trough swinging through, and you've got problems with that. Or you're waiting for that high that's north of Lake Superior and another high that's down in southern Illinois. This is the air we're waiting for, the pressure gradient. The high is not that strong, but there's still enough of a gradient here between a 1020-ish high, or actually they have it measured as a 1017, and a 979 low. So 38 millibars over a relatively small distance here between the low and the high, dictating the gradient. The winds are far less, though, once you get down into western Pennsylvania, down into West Virginia, and points west and south from there. So we just have to wait for this low to pull out far enough east to get that gradient to relax. And that may not happen until sometime during the day on Friday. It's going to take a little while to get this thing out of the way and for a little more weakening to occur. Meanwhile, as we go down into the Gulf of Mexico, you have this stalled stationary frontal boundary across the northern Gulf, and on the warm sector side of it is where you have this broad low, very large 1,005 low that's analyzed inside this large 1,008 isobar. It doesn't have that, kind of, you want that tight, well-defined circulation in order to truly define this as a tropical depression or a tropical storm. You don't quite have that here yet. You may wind up with it eventually, but right now it still remains a very, very broad low, and it might take. We'll have to wait to see convection developing near the circulation center. There's a lot of disorganized showers and thunderstorms with it on the satellite, which you'll see in a moment. But until we get that really tight area of convection near that circulation center, this is going to probably remain a potential tropical cyclone at least overnight, and maybe during the day tomorrow you'll get this upgraded to a subtropical or tropical storm. I happen to think that eventually it does get there. It just might take a little more time. Upper air conditions are certainly supportive for strengthening. The Hurricane Center points out that you have strong upper air winds and producing some wind shear, but you also have this shortwave trough that is trying to energize this in a way that a non-tropical system gets energized, and that seems to be overriding the issue regarding shear. And on the satellite loop, you see it pretty well here. The storm in the northeast, well-defined, has that signature comma swirl to it. And then you have all this shower and storm activity down in the Gulf of Mexico, and the high-level moisture pushing into the central Gulf Coast and a bit further to the north, and also back west inland of the Texas coast. I was looking really hard to see if I could find any kind of turning in there, and there is some, but again, I'm still waiting to see that one cluster, and perhaps when we go to the infrared during the overnight, you might be able to see it better. If you can pinpoint where they have the low, then we can watch to see if there's any thunderstorms that might be developing near the circulation center. You could perhaps make a case that if you watch here on the loop as it goes by, I'm going to draw it right in here. That's kind of where they have the surface load analyzed, and it looks like there's a little burst of convection going on there. But we'll see what happens when we go through the overnight. Meanwhile, on the upper left, you've got this system. This is a well-defined shortwave and trough that's moving into the western part of the United States. So pretty busy here on the U.S. satellite with everything going on. And I've brought up the high-level water vapor imagery tonight because I thought this would be a useful graphic, useful loop to look at. And by the way, GOES has been having some on and off problems today. They actually went down for a little while early this morning, and there's that frame in there. You see that frame that you just get all those lines? So hopefully that doesn't give you a headache. I'll try not to stay on it too long. But if you look at the upper air flow, we've got another deep trough that's coming into the west. Well, it was. Hold on a second. Let's see. So you got this deep trough that's coming into the west, and there's a bit of a ridge here in the middle, and now of course you've got this deep system here in the east, and right in here, this is the shortwave that I was talking about in Texas that is impacting the system in the southwestern Gulf of Mexico. And you've got all this, high-level moisture that's coming out of from the Pacific side across Mexico through the Bay of Campeche and trying to stream its way toward the northeast. So you kind of see where the flow is here in terms of where the system's going to go. Just follow that arrow I just drew. That's where I think you're going to wind up seeing. I may have it a little bit too far south and east, but perhaps more further north, Panama City, somewhere where the Hurricane Center's got their tropical storm warnings up. I think that makes complete sense. I'm going to get rid of this because now that flashing frame is starting to bother me a little bit. Okay, so let's take a look at what's going to be happening with respect to our forecast going forward. And we have we don't have it all in yet, but we have enough of the GFS that we can get a decent idea of what's going to be happening. So we'll start with the surface. And you folks watching out west, don't worry, I'm going to go to a full U.S. shot in a little while. So our big storm tomorrow morning is now up in New Brunswick. The gradient is beginning to relax. The low is pulling away. And now you're watching, at least in the GFS's world, you do see a developed low there in the central Gulf tomorrow morning, south of New Orleans, east of Brownsville, moving northeastward and approaching the Florida Panhandle, maybe somewhere near Panama City or just west of Panama City. Again, this will probably be, maybe at this point, it could be a mid-range tropical storm when it makes landfall, 50 knots, 55 knots, hard to say. Looks like there's a good, some banding coming in on the east side with rains over Florida, and then it moves northeastward. You get that rain to get into southeastern Alabama, much of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. Now, at this point, we're probably going to see this no longer be really a tropical system. It'll just be a post-tropical or extratropical system. So it'll be just like an ordinary low coming out of the Gulf states and trying to move up the southeast coast. This particular run of the GFS, and so did the NAM, does bring that rain shield up through Virginia and into southern New Jersey Sunday morning, and even touches a little bit of Long Island Sunday afternoon with a low just east of Elizabeth City, and then sliding to the east from there. Now, I don't know if I'm not 100% confident of this yet, of how far north it's going to get. At some point, it will get so far north, only so far north before it gets ejected to the east. And that'll be the determining factor. I'm thinking that clouds will certainly make their way up the coast for Saturday night and Sunday, and that the bulk of the rain should stay to the south, but we have been surprised before. And by the way, for those of you that are watching along the Gulf Coast, I just don't think there's time here for this to develop beyond a mid-level tropical storm, because it's going to be moving along. It's only moving at about 2 or 3 knots at the moment, but after tomorrow, it's going to pick up a little bit of speed as it heads towards the coastline. The GFS, it might be a little bit too fast. The NAM is a shade slower with this, but ultimately you get to the same place. I don't expect this to be any kind of big wind producer. It certainly will get gusty, and you'll probably get gales, but it may be more of a rain situation than anything else. I'll just put up the wind field on this, and you do have some pockets of sustained winds being indicated here when you look at how it shapes up the wind when it's offshore, some 40 knot plus winds, and then those winds sort of die off a bit once the low moves on land and becomes much less of a factor. And again, you're going to see this transition into a post-tropical or extratropical cyclone by the time we get to that point. Now, what's driving all this in the upper air is the fact that shortwave that I told you about back in Texas, and you can see it here, this is where it was this morning, right there, and that upper low is going to open up and push eastward. Of course, you've got our big, deep cutoff low here in the east, and then you've got this trough that's coming into the west, and there's a ridge right here that is up through the western plains and goes all the way up into Canada. So troughs on both coasts, ridge in the middle, and a little upper low that's sitting down in Texas. Your tropical system here is going to respond to that if you follow this height line like this. So it's going to want to go northeastward ahead of this shortwave trough, and we'll carry it along and see what happens. So it just kind of edges back into East Texas and over Louisiana. So at this point here, this is tomorrow morning, you've got this upper low going by to the north of this surface low, which is probably somewhere in here, and it's going to want to go in the weakness ahead of it. So rolling forward on to Saturday morning, there's your shortwave trough now approaching the Florida Panhandle. Meanwhile, your western trough is right here. Your ridge is moved toward 80, is now just to the east of 80 degrees west. Your East Coast storm is well out to the east. Now, here's the thing. If this West Coast trough were to really keep on moving, you could make an argument that this would lift this up and take it up northeastward, up along or just off the East Coast as a non-tropical system. And it kind of tries to do that here when we get to Saturday evening. You can see there's like a little bit of a weakness there in the flow, some kind of energy trying to extend itself into that short wave that's in the southeast. There's another trough that's coming in to the Rockies at the same time. So you've got this really sort of large amorphous trough that is out in the plains. The lead wave, the lead short wave that comes out of it kind of weakens a little bit, and therefore what happens is instead of lifting it up, it just never makes the connection, and as a result, the short wave is left hanging here, and it just sort of moves along in the flow going forward. So it takes it out east or east-northeast, and then once that goes by, then this trough starts to really sharpen up here. You got this upper low that's forming in eastern Nebraska. So that trough is going to be swinging eastward. A brief ridge there along the East Coast for Sunday into Monday, for later Sunday into Monday, and I think we may be able to squeeze a decent day in between whatever happens with the low along the East Coast, and then you get this next trough to swing in with a trough and strong cold front that comes through for later Tuesday night, and Wednesday. And then as we look at the longer range pattern here, that trough lifts out, next trough drops in for the end of next week. That trough lifts out, next trough drops in as we get toward the end of the month. And then now we're way out into the long range, and there's still bringing energy and troughs into the eastern part of the United States. So it's a pretty active upper air pattern that we're seeing here that is developing for the longer term. Now, for those of you who are watching outside of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, or in the Southeast and in the Eastern Gulf states, with everything that we've explained there, let's take a look at what's happening everywhere else out in the West. And of course, we've got this trough, this system coming into the West now, producing some rain and even a little bit of some snow up in the northern Rockies and into parts of Washington and Oregon. We do have a few winter storm watches that are up in that particular area. This low that develops is somewhat more moisture-starved initially once it gets to the other side, and then it starts to generate some rain when it moves through South Dakota, Iowa, and Minnesota. There's not a whole lot of snow with this because the energy with it really doesn't sharpen up until it gets well to the east of the mountains. So there really isn't time for it to develop and, of course, to impact, say, the Rockies with that moisture. And instead, you're going to get this rain that moves up from Iowa into Minnesota and the Dakotas and eventually up toward the Western Lakes. So here we are for Monday, where we've got this strong cold front here that's running from this 989 low in eastern Minnesota with a cold front that goes all the way down to the Gulf Coast. We've got some showers and thunderstorms being indicated here for the middle Mississippi Valley. And then that front swings to the East Coast. The main low goes so far to the west that you have to wonder whether there might be another wave on that front. And also, one of the things that the model is doing is trying to figure out, well, what does it do with the system off the East Coast? The GFS kind of leaves it there, well off the Virginia coast, and then pulls it northward as this next front approaches, pulls the moisture northward and just basically absorbs it into that big, that 986 low that's sitting over Lake Superior. In the meantime, behind it, we've got some chilly, dry air that comes in for the latter part of next week. And then here comes another front going into next weekend that approaches the East Coast with some energy coming out of the Gulf states and running up the eastern seaboard. So it looks like there might be a front here, a slow-moving front with a little bit of overrunning. And then behind that, it turns colder and drier. And it looks like, we are getting some shots. There's a bit more of a Canadian connection in terms of the longer-term pattern. So we're going to see colder air masses coming down. You see those blue line thicknesses getting down the 540 thickness in the long haul. That would make sense that you would see that. And I know everybody's eye is now focusing on that little blue dot and this little blue dot shading here and this little blue shading here and that little teeny tiny one up in northern New Hampshire and this little itty bitty one in southwest New York back into northwest PA. Don't. Okay? And that goes and on and on. So for where we are in the calendar, it's interesting to see this pattern setting up. I just don't know how long are we going to hold on to it? Does it hold on for the beginning of November before we have another pattern change, or is it going to hold on for the longer haul and take us deeper into November and maybe even beyond? We'll have to wait and see on that. There's a lot going on in the upper atmosphere this time of year, makes things rather turbulent. But one of the things that if you're a winter weather lover, at the very least, one of the things you should be happy about is you're not seeing any sign of a Pacific fire hose. And what I mean by the Pacific fire hose is when you have that almost straight line flow, almost a straight jet across the Pacific, across the United States, and across the Atlantic, with everything moving really fast from west to east. So even though you're getting these troughs moving into the west, they're moving along. And there's a tendency lately for models to show troughing along 160 degrees west, down around the longitude of Hawaii. And that's important because if you have a trough out here, you're going to have a ridge here, and then you're going to have the trough wanting to be in the eastern part of the United States. That seems to be where the models have been going with this. Certainly in the prior runs that has been the case. And you can see later next week, you do have a trough that lines up near 160. And then when that pulls out, another one tries to drop in. But you still have troughing mostly in the east. You can see it here later in the forecast period. You've got this low near the Aleutians. It's not a deep trough all the way down to Hawaii, but the upper low is along the latitude of the Aleutians. So the ridge is all along the west coast, and you've got a deep upper low in eastern Canada and troughing that wants to continue to be in the eastern part of the United States. There's also a little bit of a blocky high that develops here later next week up near Greenland. You see it there, but it's very transitory. It's there, and then it gets eaten away and it's gone. So I wouldn't put too much. I wouldn't necessarily put a whole lot of stock in something, a negative North Atlantic oscillation pattern setting up for anything other than a very, very short-term time frame. That's the word I'm looking for. Time frame. Okay. Now, a couple of things. Let's go back to the cyclone, potential tropical cyclone 16. The blue is where we have tropical storm warnings up from southeast Louisiana, and then that little gap there in Mississippi where there's no warning up. And then you have the warning up from the Alabama-Mississippi border into Florida, into the Florida Panhandle, and then a watch down to not quite close to Tampa St. Pete, well north and west of Tampa St. Pete. But you see how the Hurricane Center is tracking this as a tropical storm and then holding it as a post-tropical storm once it moves inland to Georgia, to eastern North Carolina by 1 p.m. Sunday, and then well south and east of Block Island. This is at around 37 and a half, and about 70 degrees west. But if it's more of a post-tropical system here, you're going to wind up seeing at the very least clouds being pushed up to the northwest side of this, and that rain shield may not be that far away. So that's something that I want to keep a close eye on. And the other thing I wanted to discuss tonight is that the Weather Service has come out with their winter forecast. Okay, now I've always had, it's not as simple. When the Weather Service puts out their winter forecast, they're not necessarily telling you above normal and below normal. They're just rating the probability, okay? The probability that it will be cooler than average or warmer than average, okay? The white area is a 33% probability of either above normal, below normal, or near normal, okay? 33, 33, 33 equals 100. So in the light brown area is where the Weather Service says that there is a 40% probability that the temperatures are going to be above average, all right? So if you want to do the math, you could say there's a 40% chance of it being above average, a 30% chance of being below average, and a 30% chance of it being average. Okay, or you could say that there's a 70% chance of it being up near or above average. We could go on all day with this. I have never been a fan of this approach, okay? Because it's not clear. It really isn't that clear. It's just saying that the probability across the southern part of the United States, the probability, there's a 50% probability that across the southern states that temperatures are going to be above average. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the other 50% means that it's going to be below average. You follow what I'm getting at here? So I think they're doing this basically from a mathematical and technical perspective, but I think the measurements it gets lost in the public's eye when they do maps like this. To me, it's confusing. Now, what I would get from this is that if you assume that the where they have the temperatures that are supposed to be near average or equal chances of below and above, which would be across the Great Lakes and the Dakotas, you could look at this, and if you wanted to draw, say, a mean trough and a mean ridge, you could probably do it something like this. Okay. So I'm sorry. Hang on. I got to make sure I got to. Oh, that was dandy. It's out of control. Stop it. You silly graphic. Oh, this is ridiculous. Thank you. All right, hang on a second. Let's try that again. That was too funny. Okay, so if you want to look at this, oh, it's being mean to me. Hold on. Let me get rid of this. Let's get this. Let me open the image up. Now we can do this. Let's try this and get rid of that. A long day. All right, so if you want to look at how they have the temperatures outlined, you would have a ridge here in the west, a trough kind of in the middle, and a ridge just off the east coast. Okay, so that's where your mean trough would be. So this would kind of argue, in my view, that if the trough is this far west, the trough is maybe along about 90 degrees west. That's not exactly where you would want it if you are an East Coast snow fan. All right. Then again, you're talking about 90 days of weather here, the average of 90 days of weather. So you might have that mean trough for the winter setting up at 90 degrees west, but I'll bet you at times it'll be closer to 80, and maybe at other times it'll be flat, or maybe closer to 100 or 110. Maybe at some point in the winter we'll probably see the trough want to go to the west for a short period of time. But that's what their forecast is, and again, I don't really put too much weight into it. Clearly my drawing abilities aren't putting too much weight into it, and this should be, but it isn't. I tried to have the precip outlook up. I'm not understanding why I'm having this problem here with this page. Let's see if it flips. All right, it's trying. Let's open the image up and let me get rid of the Facebook thing. So here's the precip in terms of above normal, and the same principles apply here. So in that darker green, it looks like that's where they have 40 to 50%. I'm trying to match up the colors, or if that's 40 to 50% chance of wetter than increased probability of above average precip running from just about our coastline west northwest up into the Dakotas and into Montana and into northeastern Wyoming. Also below average in that area in southeast Texas and Louisiana, and in California, in central the coastal areas, the areas even the interior, I guess, central and northern California. So the forecast is what it is. We look for them because we want to look for them, and inevitably they really don't tell us very much about where things are going to ultimately wind up. I would just point out that if you go back and look at the winter forecasts of 13-14 and 14-15, I bet you they didn't have it right as far as the cold in the east and certainly with respect to snowfall. And always remember that when it comes to the winter forecasts in the northeastern part of the United States, there's always that variable of the North Atlantic Oscillation, which you have to worry about as far as setting up for a cold pattern in the east. But that has been something that has seldom appeared in the last 4 or 5 winters anyway. So I don't really, I've said many times, I think the darn thing's overrated. Everybody screams about it and jumps up and down over it, and to me it's a big yawn. When it's there, it's there. When it's not, it's not. I've said I've always wanted the negative EPO, the East Pacific Oscillation, to me is much more important. Okay, so here are your watches and warnings tonight. You can see the tropical storm warnings that are up for the Gulf of Mexico. In the wake of this storm in the Northeast, you've got frost advisories and freezes in Michigan, and the frosts all the way down into the Carolina and eastern Tennessee mountains and the mountains of western Virginia, and also in through much of Kentucky. You've got some winter storm watches up in parts of central Idaho and in western Washington, seeing some winter storm watches that are up in that area. So going to join you now all in the chat. So hang on for 1 second. And Scott Briller and Paul Roman tonight. The chairman is back, and his mom is feeling better, and we are happy to hear that. So great, that's terrific. And thanks for hitting Super Chat, Scott Briller and Paul Roman tonight. Thank you so very much. Mac Attack is the next trough that moves through the east on Tuesday into Wednesday, partly due to Typhoon Hagibis that hit Japan last week. I think it is. I think that the typhoon has energized the action in the Gulf of Alaska to drive the trough deep down into toward Hawaii, and that creates the ridge in the west and the trough in the east. It is certainly keeping that eastern trough active through much of the long-range period. So the answer to your question is yes, I really absolutely believe that. Just as much as Lorenzo started the ball rolling and changing the pattern across Europe, it pretty much created a chain reaction all the way across, and you see the result of it now. It took about a week or so to play out, but it certainly played out in a very interesting way in that we wound up with Melissa and the coastal flooding, and now, of course, this major storm that we got yesterday and today hitting the northern mid-Atlantic states and on up into New England. So I'm just running back here. Michelle Henderson, thank you very much. She's wishing everyone to be safe and dry, which is a good thing. Javon Perry, nice to see you on board. Yes, Christinapedia. I know, with the right click and the copy image address, well, I was able to open it. This computer, sometimes it gets hung up. If I've got too many GIFs opened up and I close them, so once I close them, the computer seems to respond better. So, but yeah, I of course, one of the things, folks, that I'm doing, by the way, is I'm using a software program, an open source software program called OBS, Open Broadcast Studio. It's basically a television control room switcher that directors use. It's technical, and I am not only producing my show and starring in my show, but I'm actually also doing jobs of the directors and the technical directors and the audio person and the graphics person all at the same time with my two little hands. So that's why at times it gets frustrating when the computer doesn't cooperate or the mouse doesn't cooperate. So I appreciate your patience very much. The Weather Channel releases their forecast for the winter as well. Okay. And I can only guess what they're going to be saying. Is it better to be warmer or average in October or November if you want a good winter? Okay, Bobby Livingsworth. So that would depend, I guess, on where you live, as far as that goes. So that would be one issue that you would have to look at. But if you're talking about the I-95 corridor, I would probably look more toward November. I think November might be a better indicator, but I only vaguely kind of looked at data over the years. At best, it's only slightly conclusive. I don't know that if you have a big enough data set to really come to terms with that. Some people that have looked into it say, November's the month you really kind of want to look at. So I try to look at November to see what kind of pattern does it look like we're going to be getting into, because at some point in December, we lock into what will be the primary pattern theme for the winter time. Actually, if you think about it, we saw that last year and how storms evolved. And you might see it. So I look at November as maybe an early indicator, and I wait to see what the pattern flips to in December to give me a real good feel for where the winter is going. And at the end of the day, I just sort of ride with the flow. It is what it is. Chuck Cardillo, thanks for hitting Super Chat tonight. Really appreciate it. I got a cigar and a cup of coffee with the Super Chat hits tonight. So thank you very much. Okie AG is on board. Nice to see you, Okie. I haven't seen you here in a bit. I'm rolling backwards on the chat to see what... if I missed any questions. And Scott Briller pointing out that on this date in 1938, before we had climate change, and before we had television in every home, and before we had news operations on television, on this date in 1938, Central Park recorded its latest 90-degree day ever. And as snow weenies were canceling winter, a Christmas miracle happened, and 5 weeks later, 13 inches of snow fell. You actually, you bring up one point. There were a few times where we had big snows that fell, early season big snows, which might even not be that big, the scope of things, but a 4, 5, 6 inch snowfall or something along those lines. A lot of those in the early part of the season do tend to come after we've had some kind of big warm-ups. I'm not sure, whether that's, basically a signal of a big ridge breaking down, being replaced by a wholesale deep trough or not. I don't know. But that's not the first time where you've had, something extreme on one end, and then you jump a handful of weeks later and you wind up having an extreme on the other, and both of those things happening somewhat out of their traditional seasons. It seems for the last 20 years, the southwest ridge has become stronger and lasts all winter. The southwest or the southeast? I think you could probably make a case for, I don't know, maybe the last few winters, perhaps, the southeast ridge, but not all of them. And you got to remember, too, you have to have, for storms along the East Coast, you actually do have to have a little bit of ridging off the southeast. You can't have it flat as a board off the southeast coast, or you'll have what happened last year, is where you had lows that came across the southern stream and couldn't make the turn and climb up the East Coast because the flow was so darn flat. There was no traffic in the Atlantic. You need some ridging there So you need some kind of storm out offshore to create a little bit of ridging off the East Coast to get a system to turn up. And then, of course, you have to have all the other puzzle pieces setting up. Timothy Veltman, I'm cautiously optimistic going forward, seeing this 6-wave northern hemisphere pattern. I'm not familiar with what the 6-wave pattern is. Setting up to the end of October leaves room for opportunities for storminess at least. So I'm not. Somebody's going to have to explain to me what the 6-wave northern hemisphere pattern is. There's so much stuff that you guys learn in school now that we never had. Just want you to know that. Wondering where the Bay of Campeche is located, if I'm saying it correctly. Paul Roman, the Bay of Campeche is the southwest Gulf of Mexico, in between the western part of the Yucatan Peninsula and Texas. And Mexico. Just for example, I will show you on the map. So the Bay of Campeche is, let me get this, and this thing better behave itself. Okay, so right in here, this area, that's the Bay of Campeche. All right? Bay of Campeche, southwest Gulf. Usually when a system is, a lot of times, when they use the reference point, if they say it's in the southwest Gulf, it's usually because they think it's going to be moving toward the northwest, north, or northeast Gulf. If they say it's in the Bay of Campeche, it's usually when the Hurricane Center seems to think that it's going to be trapped in the Bay of Campeche and stay down in that particular zone. Okay, again, rolling backwards. It does look like it's going to be colder toward the end of the month, certainly, Bobby Livingsworth, the way the pattern is holding up. Reaver talking about Henry Margosity, excited about heavy snows this year. Look, if it's a typical winter where we're not dealing with any kind of overcharged El Nino or La Nina, then we'll have, I would suspect that we will have opportunities along the way. I just think that this sort of notion that it's going to be nonstop snow in the I-95 corridor that will get underway on the 1st of November and continue almost daily until April 1st of 2020, that's just not going to happen. I'll find the tweet and I saw, if I can, Joe, and tag you in it. There should be 6 waves of low pressure over the northern hemisphere with amplitude in the jet stream flow. All right. I'm just wondering what the theory is behind how did they get 6? Why 6? Why not 5? Why not 7? I'm just kind of curious. But yeah, please do. I'd love to see it. Let's see. Just running through the end here. Kane is on. Nice to see you. And Jeff D. Ryan is on board tonight. Always good to see you here, Ryan. Donna Levasseur also on. And yes, Donna, those Levittown mudslides. So ABC 7 here in New York, I think on their app, on the weather part of their app, had a thing yesterday for the forecast for Levittown, New York, which is right on Long Island, by the way. For those of you who don't know, it's in Nassau County on Long Island. It's a very, it's a typical suburb of one-family homes for the most part. It was Levittown. There's also a Levittown in Pennsylvania, named after Mr. Levitt, who designed these homes in order to encourage people to move out of the big city and into these suburban one-family homes and create these neighborhoods. And this was back in I believe it was in the 1940s. Okay, well, they put out their forecast, and Levittown is just to the east of New York City, the New York City line in Queens. With all the storminess that was going on yesterday, they were forecasting mudslides. Okay, now I think that probably has to do with the fact that somebody maybe checked off the wrong box when they were setting up their forecast page for the day, or perhaps it triggered, some code was put in wrong somewhere along the line. So I don't think it was done intentionally, but it was kind of funny to see mudslides in Levittown. Broken wing. Why do storms not develop as much off the west coast of Africa and develop more in the Caribbean or Gulf this time of year? Because this time of year, out in the eastern Atlantic, you start to get deep troughs. Cooler water comes down in the East Atlantic and goes all the way down. Comes down from the Northeast Atlantic and goes all the way down into off the African coast. So water temperature is lower. Plus the trade winds. The most important thing in the trade winds, the east to west winds that blow from Africa west across the Atlantic to the other side, they start to weaken pretty rapidly once you get toward the latter part of September and early October. So when these systems come off the African coast, there's no push to push them westward. You may the Tropical Depression 15 from a couple of days ago, exactly what happened. It moved off the African coast. There was no push there in the trade winds, all very weak at this stage. Everything is shifting southward. You're seeing these systems come off, and then they either die out, or as in the case of this depression, it turned northwest near the Cabo Verde Islands, and that's it. So it's very rare to see something make it out off the African coast this time of year and develop out there. Sometimes you do get waves that make it across, weak waves, and then they flare up when they get into the Caribbean or perhaps when they get to the Atlantic west of 60 degrees west, but you hardly ever see them to the east of there once we get to this point in the calendar, which is October 17th. Ryan Ford, you get the last question tonight. Why is it that there are hardly any coastal storms in the Gulf or southeast U.S. in the wintertime, and it's just a northeastern thing? Well, no, the thing about the the lows that come out of the Gulf of Mexico and head for the southeast, they're in their formative stages when they're down there. So it's rare. On occasion it does happen where if you get the jet stream the trough is so deep and so far south that you get a storm that develops in the Gulf of Mexico that starts to intensify while it's in the Gulf and get down into the 990s. And I've seen that happen on rare occasions. Then you wind up with a fairly deep low that could be off the southeast coast of the United States. But that doesn't happen very often at all because you usually have to wait for them to gain latitude where, the bottom of the trough, the strongest part of the trough and the shortwave tend to be further to the north. You notice when you go north of New York City, you head up toward Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, sometimes you get these lows that are in the 950s. Occasionally you get those lows get down even below 950, but you don't really see 950-ish lows off the New Jersey coast very often. So here too, we'll see 980s, 970s on occasion, 970s. Every once in a while you'll see something in the 960s, but the same thing. The further north, the storms tend to get more and more intense. These non-tropical cyclones, you get down into the Gulf states, not so much. But when you see them down there, they are in their formative stages. Okay, let's see. Before we go, I'm just going to pull up the latest advisory, see if the Hurricane Center did anything, and I doubt that they did. Nope. Potential tropical cyclone 16, maximum sustained winds 40 miles an hour, 23.3 north, 94.6 west, moving northeast at 9, which is a little faster now than what it was before. It is 225 miles east-northeast of Tampico, Mexico, 525 miles southwest of the mouth of the Mississippi River. So it does have a lot of ground to cover. It's got over 500 miles of water to cross before it comes close to any land. We'll see if it's going to have time to develop. I think it's going to get to tropical storm strength. I doubt it'll have time to get much beyond that. Doesn't have a purely tropical environment to work with, and that'll probably hold it back somewhat. Usually when these systems, when they develop where they kind of look non-tropical, they have to spend some time making that full transition to a tropical system. So if this were something that had like truly total tropical origin to it, you might see it develop faster, but that is definitely not the case this time around. Okay, so Winko 567. Okay, you get the last question tonight, and that is the chances of it striking Tampa Bay. I think it goes north of Tampa Bay. Okay, I think it's going to be more on the northern part of the Florida Panhandle, somewhere in there. But it's going to have a. It's not going to have a truly classic tropical look to it. So we'll have to watch and see how the rain shield sets up. You probably will get some rain out of this, but I don't think it's going to be anything that you can't handle. Reaver, you want to know if I plan to donate all my ties when I leave FiOS? I'd like to donate them now. I must have 200 or 300 of them. I must have every tie I've ever owned, because I'm not good at throwing things away. But I will figure out what to do with them at some point. There must be some tie charity of some kind, people that donate ties. I don't know. All right, that's it for tonight, folks. Remember the app, download it. It's free. The Meteorologist Joe Chaffee app on Google Play or on the App Store. The Angry Ben's Weather app, the Angry Weatherman, is available too, also free on Google Play. So be sure you download both apps and do enjoy them. And I always appreciate feedback. So if you have opinions to share, by all means, share them. And we will have Weather in 5 tomorrow morning as we update you on what happens overnight and what we expect to happen going forward. We'll probably have some developments with regards to potential tropical cyclone 16. And we will have our Friday night live stream, which will be at, we'll shoot for 7 o'clock Eastern time for tomorrow. All right. Thanks again, everybody, for being here. It's been a nice, solid hour of weather fun tonight. We'll see you tomorrow.